All right, so for our last evening, I want to do two major things. One is I want to take a very close look at the Clinton Camp David effort to conclude a peace treaty with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. And I want to look at some of the unraveling of that and look, and in particular, uh, to think about the way the narratives from the Palestinian side and the Israeli side have developed around that. And then I want to take some time to sort of catch us up to now. What's happened in Israel, Palestine, in the Middle East to now, and sort of finish with a sort of rumination about the difficulties and the possibilities of a two-state solution paradigm moving forward. So it's a big agenda, and hopefully I can get at least some of it done. But let's talk about the Camp David Accords. I'll share my screen in a minute. But if you recall, Oslo had an interim period of time between 1995, 1999, in which, final status negotiations were supposed to be approved, right? So there was this effort in this period of time, and as human beings are, the deadline really loomed and put a lot of pressure on people. And then in the year 2000, as elections were coming in Israel and in the United States, and you think about Ehud Barak as the leader of the Labor Party in Israel, not Labor, but a middle of the road party, they sort of inheriting the mantle of Labor, and Ariel Sharon bringing a campaign from the right as head of the Likud opposition at this time, sort of in the background or in the context of Israeli politics. And then thinking about the United States, right? Bill Clinton finishing up his second term as president of the United States, and a presidential election with George W. Bush campaigning strongly with the Republican nomination. Very different agendas about how to proceed regarding the Palestinians in particular. And of course, all of this is before 9/11, right? So the terrorist attacks in 9/11, Al-Qaeda, the emergence of Islamic terrorism on a global stage in that way. I mean, it's not like it hadn't existed, really shakes things up. And we're about to see what happens here. But I think it's useful to sort of zoom back into that space politically to think about what's happening. Now, the effort that Clinton had after being impeached, the Monica Lewinsky affair, to try to somehow salvage his reputation and build on his legacy with other peace agreements, right, in other parts of the world, was, sort of explains a little bit about the intensity to which, Clinton approaches this. But before they even get to the actual Camp David meeting with president and the prime minister and Arafat there, president of the Palestinian Authority, there are these back low-level sort of second-level efforts between the Israeli diplomat, ambassador Iran, and Palestinian negotiator Yasser Abed Rabo. And those names are not well known, obviously. But what's interesting about those talks that precede the Camp David talks is they were in Israel and in the West Bank, back and forth, and they're all focused on those final status issues, right? Remember the Oslo Accord said, we're going to talk about all that stuff later. We just want a framework. We're going to recognize each other, which in many ways was maybe more important. A lot. I mean, I'll leave that for you to evaluate, but that mutual recognition and the agreement that we're going to be negotiating a peace agreement, we're going to do this, all happened. But the meat and potatoes of what they were arguing about, refugees and Jerusalem and where the borders would be and the right of, all of those things were left on the shelf. And here, these negotiations prior to this Camp David meeting in 2000 was all about that stuff. Now, it started with a offer from Israel, which was kind of a lowball offer to give the Palestinians 60 to 70% of the West Bank. Now, anybody who's done any kind of negotiations in business knows you don't come in with your best offer first, but that was the approach. Now, politics, let me remind everyone, is a lot different than business. But if you approach it from that deal-making kind of paradigm of business, you can see where they were coming from. Now, so that's where they start. Now, meanwhile, Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat also had a secret channel that they were starting to negotiate with each other, right? So they have these underlings talking to each other. And then Arafat and Barak, Ehud Barak, are talking in May of 2000 in Stockholm, and with the foreign minister for Israel, and on the Palestinian side from Ahmed Quiri. Okay, and the reason I mention those names is because, okay, so Quiri is the speaker of the Palestinian National Congress. He's the speaker of their assembly, right? The legislative council. And he's also the most senior member of the Fatah Central Committee. So he's at the top, right next to Arafat. And the other person that's up there at the top is the current president, Mahmoud Abbas, who has no idea that this is going on. Right? So this is really important. Abbas is completely in the dark about that. And he is, ironically, the head of the PLO's negotiations department. Clinton, not a part of this either. He's out of it as well. So all of this gets totally blown up because, I should probably not use that language, but ruined because it gets leaked in the press from some of the Palestinian, that we think it's some of the Palestinian negotiating team in June. And that ends it. And more importantly, it damages relationships between Mahmoud Abbas and Ahmed Quiri. Meanwhile, there's this ongoing Israeli effort to try to negotiate. Let me let him in here. To try to negotiate an end to the Syrian-Israeli, to come to some agreement. And there's not.
I got it. I will let people in, Scott. Don't worry about that at all.
Okay. So, and anyway, so there's no progress being, thank you, Sylvia. There's no progress being made there. And so Israel decides that under Ehud Barak, that they will make a unilateral withdrawal from southern Lebanon. And they start this in May 24th of 2000. Well, what's the result? As soon as Israel gets out of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah takes control of the evacuated Israeli strongholds and disarms the South Lebanese army, which is Israel's ally there. And Hezbollah goes all around the world saying, hey, look what we did. We defeated Israel, right? We pushed them out of southern Lebanon. And so that's the context. And then comes the Camp David meeting. And I want to share my screen now. Okay. Sorry, all this stuff is in here. Let's get out of there and out of there. And where's my slides? Here it is. It's so funny, you put everything together right before you get on, and then it just messes everything up. I don't understand computers played from the current side. Okay, so right, so the 2000 Camp David negotiations start here, right? And they're addressing all of what's going to happen: borders, security, Jerusalem, refugees. Remember, back in 1996, they had created these three areas. 42% is now of the West Bank is now being controlled by the Palestinians. But there are all these roadblocks and checkpoints between areas A, B, and C throughout. And so Clinton is, trying to get talks going. And Governor Bush from Texas, who will become president, is saying out loud, look, that he really doesn't have much faith in Ehud Barak, but he really likes Ariel Sharon, who's the Likud leader. And in these negotiations, right, Barak proposed close to 92% of the West Bank. This is what he's proposing, putting on the table. I'm going to give you the Palestinian Authority 92% of the West Bank. We're going to put the capital of the Palestinian state, this new independent state. Most importantly, they're saying you're going to have your own state. You're going to have your own nation. That's the most important thing. And it's going to be here on most of the vast majority, over 90% of the West Bank. And you're going to have your capital in East Jerusalem, and you're going to have those Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. So the question is, what happened, right? And I think I showed you some of this film footage, but it might be useful just to see it again, just to get a flavor for what this is looking like here. The drama of it all.
So I have to set a good example. You're difficult to resist, but I will make it today.
Is that the only agreement you have reached so far?
That would be answering your question. Thank you.
So obviously they don't come to much agreement. But there is this question mark that's sort of overlooking all this. Like, what happened if Israel, from Israel's perspective, right, from Israel's narrative, they put on the best possible offering, the most concessions that had ever been made to the Palestinians in the history of their efforts to try to come to peace with them, and that it was rejected, right? It was rejected. It didn't work. And we talked about some ideas about who's to blame, and that's really going to be important, not only because I'm in the blame game, but which I'm not, but more because of the political import of how you ascribe a responsibility for the failure of previous efforts, and what therefore will be the obligation of future efforts moving forward. So I think that's really critical for us to understand. It's not so much a moral judgment I'm talking about here. It's more of a political evaluation of what it means to be the ones who's responsible for example, for the war, right? We've talked about this before. Who's responsible for 67? Was that a war that Israel chose to attack Egypt, or, right, as the Egyptians were saying, or was that a preemptive attack for its own self-defense? Really different impact in terms of how you deal with the outcome of that war of 1967, who is responsible for the land that Israel gets as a result. The same thing happens in a different kind of way with these negotiations over this 2000 Camp David, right? And what I'm really talking about is over 5 different developments: that Camp David summit, a press conference, which you can watch later, where Clinton basically indirectly blames Arafat for the failure to achieve a breakthrough at Camp David. And then there are all these other efforts, right? That isn't the end of it. right? There's a lot of talk that that's the end of the Oslo process. But the truth is, there continues to be efforts, even as the second intifada begins, which we'll talk about, which is not a small thing. That's a giant thing, right? So there's lots of talks between Israelis and Palestinians in August and September in various places trying to save this Camp David effort, including an attempt by Egypt to get in there and help, and a visit, really interesting. Arafat actually goes to Ehud Barak's home in Israel in early September. And then there are these, then there's this really historic meeting at the Bolling Air Force Base outside of Washington, D.C. They kind of land there and stay there and talk. And it's at that place where Clinton says, here you go. Here's how you're going to solve your problem. And those became known as the Clinton parameters, which I'll show you in a minute. And then finally, we'll get to these talks in Egypt, in the resort town of Taba in 2001. So let's start with a nearly 2-week summit in Camp David that began in, I think, right, and we'll take a look at some of what was offered there, right? So this is, you got Clinton, you got Arafat, you got their people, right? And the focus is on those final status things. The border, what will the borders be of the Palestinian state, and therefore the borders of Israel in that area, which is still undetermined by international law. What's going to happen to security? How are you going to guarantee security for the Israelis, right? That's a big concern, of course, and also the Palestinians concerned about that. What are you going to do about Jerusalem, which is a major, major question, because after 1967, when Israel took the all of Jerusalem and annexed it and formed and put it under Israeli law, that was a major piece of Israel's identity right? It's not that it was never there before, but even more so now, and a unified Jerusalem became a very, very powerful motivator for Israel. And so now you're talking like, well, what's going to be, how can Palestine, if that's going to be the name of the country, have its capital in East Jerusalem, and Israel still have a unified Jerusalem? That's going to be a big question. And then the issue of refugees, right? So we've talked about this before, but just to remind you, after 1967, there was this UN resolution that said that there's the right of return, according to the United Nations, that Palestinians who had lost their, after 1948, lost their homes as a result of the 1948, could come back to their homeland. And the question is whether that means only those people who at that time, or their ancestors, right? That's what the resolution after 1967 says, their ancestors, and the demographics of the country of Israel, such that it would have a Jewish majority, would be deeply threatened if the diaspora Palestinians who are all over the world, particularly in Jordan and Syria, were to return. Then very soon afterwards, Israel would lose its Jewish majority. So that's a big question too. What do you do about, how do you handle all these things? The interesting thing is, another issue that is critical for the Middle East wasn't addressed: water, right? We've talked about water and the fights over water between Syria and Israel and the Golan Heights, and control over the river and the flow down, and what that has meant. And water is going to become increasingly important, as it is in the United States. Here in California, we know about the recently renegotiated compact over the Colorado River and how difficult that has been, and the federal government is pushing to get that resolved all the world over, and all the more so in a desert with millions and millions and millions of people, with lots of power inequalities economically. Okay, that wasn't even on the table and hasn't been really seriously discussed since. So Saeb Erekat who's a senior Palestinian negotiator, and Gilad Sher, who's a foreign minister, are sitting down trying to negotiate this. And they get together after the summit, and they have like 30 different sessions where they're trying to get to an agreement. And then the second intifada breaks out on September the 28th, and their efforts are upended. And it's in that context that Ariel Sharon, and I'm going to come back to some of this in a minute, who's running for prime minister, right, as the head of Likud, the opposition party, goes to the Temple Mount, which is it's not been done before, right? It hasn't been done in many, many years. And he basically says, look, Israel has to control this place. This is a holy place that's important to the Jews, right? And we have to control it. And that's a direct response to Ehud Barak's stated willingness to negotiate on dividing Jerusalem. And so when he's up there, the second intifada, there's protests, right? There's Palestinian protests, and the Israeli Defense Forces respond. And this erupts in terrible violence, and it just gets a lot worse. And that's the beginning of the second intifada. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But I did want to get back to this. The fact that all of this is happening, you would think maybe, well, that's it, it's over. But they get back to negotiations at the Bolling Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. And unlike the Camp David summit, this is just Israel's foreign minister Shlomo Ben-Ami and Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat. And they're talking, and they're getting closer, and they're getting closer. And then President Clinton says, okay, here's the thing. We're close enough. Come to the White House. And on December 23rd, he reads to them these. This is what it's going to be. Take it or leave it. This becomes known as the Clinton parameters, right? Palestinians are going to get 95% of the West Bank. Israel is going to be divided. Arab communities will go to the Palestinians. Jewish communities will go to Israel. Some right of return. Not everybody. But Israel, in return for that limitation on the right of return, would have to accept this vague aspiration of Palestinians to come, right? The holy places, in particular the Temple Mount, Clinton says Palestinians will have sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Israel will have sovereignty over the Western Wall. Hello, right? And this is it, right? So Clinton says, give me a response, Ehud Barak. Give me a response, Yasser Arafat. Let me know. You have 5 days.
Scott, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I had put it in, it's Rosalie. This right of return, before you said ancestors, I think you mean descendants, but I'm not sure.
That's what I meant. I'm sorry. Yes.
You did mean descendants, because
Yes.
yeah, you kept saying ancestors, and so
I meant descendants, yes.
Okay, that's
Descendants
it.
of the people who had lost their homes in the 1948.
Right, because there
Yeah.
could be trillions by now. Okay, thank you.
Yes, exactly. A lot. I don't know if trillions, but millions for sure. But yes, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You're absolutely right. And you should always correct me on that stuff. So here's what happens. Ehud Barak says, he waits a day, less than a day, and he says, okay, we accept this. We accept this as the basis for negotiation of the final status agreement. Tricky, huh? And we have some reservations. Arafat is even less committed, but he finally gives his conditional approval on January the 2nd, 2001. But Clinton's kind of pissed, right? It doesn't seem like Arafat's really committed. So on January 21st, they get together in Taba, and you can sort of see what's happening with this West Bank, right? The Palestinian, these are the final status. This is what's presented at Taba, right? About all of these areas that are in solid grays are going to be Palestinian autonomous areas. These other brown areas are going to have Palestinian sovereignty, but not full autonomy, whatever that means. That means that Israeli military patrols will continue. There'll be these little blue areas where there'll be Israeli sovereignty. Still, these are the settlements that will stay, and the light blue areas are going to be no man's lands, as defined as an armistice since 1949. And then there's some areas that will be defined as Israeli territory that are going to be swapped as part of a 3% land swap. So that's what they come up with. They're there, they're in Taba, which is just south of Eilat, and they're negotiating this. And the Palestinians are really wondering whether Ehud Barak even has the authority to negotiate anything, because it looks like he's unpopular. And it looks like in the upcoming election that Ariel Sharon and the Likud party is going to replace him. Among the Israelis, they're very doubtful that the Taba talks are going to succeed. First of all, Arafat didn't seem so excited about the parameters and was reluctant to engage. And they didn't really feel like it was appropriate for Ehud Barak to do this at the last minute. It seemed like an election ploy for him to try to save himself to get reelected. Nonetheless, they meet anyway under those not so auspicious circumstances, and they negotiate for about 7 days, and they never get to the agreement. But, and this is really interesting, they issue a joint communique at the end of this week where they say, both the Palestinians and the Israelis together say, quote, "The sides declare that they have never been closer to reaching an agreement, and it is thus our shared belief that the remaining gaps could be bridged with the resumption of negotiations following the Israeli elections." So, right, Sharon wins. I'm going to go back to that picture of Sharon here. Right here he is during the campaign. He wins the elections. And it ends the diplomatic efforts. They're not going to start again for another 6 more years till 2007. And part of the reason is because of the emergence of the Second Intifada. And Israel's refusal to negotiate until the violence ends. It basically means the Oslo process is over at this point. So the question is, what really happened at Camp David? And as I mentioned, a couple of things I want to point out here. Ehud Barak started out in Camp David in 2000, offering, right before it was only 60%, he offers 66% of the West Bank, and that Israel would retain their major settlements. And basically the West Bank would be cut up into 3 sections with full Israeli control from Jerusalem to the Jordan River. There'd be an additional 14% of the land that would also be held for about 12 to 20 years. 12 to 20 years. We're not sure how long, including west of the Jordan River and Hebron and Kiryat Arba. The Palestinians would get, after 20 years, says Barak in this initial offer, 80% of the West Bank and Gaza. So that was the initial offer. That was rejected. And by the way, Barak was also proposing 2 capitals in that: Jerusalem for the Israelis, Al-Quds for the Palestinians. And that was the name that was given to Abu D, which is a Palestinian village on the outside of the Israeli-controlled East Jerusalem. It's not really directly connected to the old city. So that's all of that's really important. Israel's going to hold all of Jerusalem, east and west. And of course, the Palestinians, when they look at all this, they say 20 years, then we get 80%. We don't get Jerusalem. No. We want all of the expanded East Jerusalem, say the Palestinians. So the next offer, according to inside reports, was that Barak said 90%, 89.5%, still unacceptable to the Palestinians. And for the Israelis, Arafat's position on the right of return, that had to be absolute, without any limitations, was unacceptable. There's some back channel talks and all of that. All of their efforts are rejected. I'm going to go back to what his proposal is. I think this is it. Yeah. So here's what Barak's proposal is. Suddenly, Ehud Barak shocks everybody in the room. He says, okay, take 91% of the West Bank, sovereignty over the other 15%, over 15% of the border with Israel, basically, with Jordan, the border with Jordan, sovereignty over 15%, where previously that was 0. They would have no sovereignty over that border. With regard to Jerusalem, Barak says here, 7 out of the 9 outer neighborhoods would be under Palestinian sovereignty. The inner neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, the Palestinians would be in charge of planning and zoning in the old city, and they would run all of the Muslim and Christian neighborhoods. The Temple Mount would be handed over by the United Nations to be governed by the Palestinians and Morocco together. And the refugee problem would be addressed with a quote unquote satisfactory solution. So when Barak made this proposal, it freaked out everybody. Nobody had seen it coming. His own team didn't know what was happening. And Barak didn't say it directly to Arafat. He said it to Clinton. And he's like, look, I want you to tell this to Arafat. And I want you to tell Arafat, this is Ehud Barak telling Clinton this. I want you to tell Arafat this is a take it or leave it proposal. No questions asked. And if you take it, it's over. And an important piece of this is that Ehud Barak says, if Arafat accepts this, I want a file closed certification. I want a statement that this is over. Our conflict is officially over. We're not arguing anymore about any of this stuff. It's done. So you get my best offer, 91% of the West Bank, another big chunk of Jerusalem, control over 15% of the border with Jordan, joint control with other countries, not with Israel, Morocco, the UN, over the holy sites that are important to you. Done. And some refugee acknowledgement that you're going to have refugee return. Okay, so Arafat hesitates. He's thinking, look, some of these statements could be interpreted differently depending on who you are, as is what happened with the Oslo Accords. I thought we were going to have a lot more of this land by now, says Arafat to himself. And it's clear to the Palestinians that Clinton is not a neutral observer, that he's acting on behalf of Barak. Barak asked Clinton to offer this to Barak asked Clinton to offer this to Arafat. So now all of a sudden, it's Arafat versus the Israelis and the Americans. And then there's the question over what's going to happen if he gives up control over the Temple Mount, that he might be assassinated, as Michael pointed out last week, right? finally, the Palestinian state that is being proposed is not going to be contiguous. Israel will still retain a road from Jerusalem all the way through to the Jordan River. It would cut through, over which the Palestinians would have zero authority. And so there's all these different interpretations. The issue of control or lack of control was the heart of the difference between the Israeli and Palestinian interpretations. For the Palestinians, that road bisecting Palestinian lands and would give an Israeli surveillance in the tunnel beneath those roads meant that Palestine would not be really independent. For the Israelis, the fact that Jerusalem would be split means that we lose control over our capital, right? So claims that any of these things were the things that killed the entire talks, not quite accurate, but it's all an important part. It's an important part of the distrust. When Clinton refused to clarify for Arafat what Barak's ideas about the shared custody over the Temple Mount would mean, the talks collapsed. And then Clinton blamed Arafat for the failure of the entire summit. What's interesting about this, right, is they both go on and they claim victory for their respective constituencies. Arafat says to his people, I didn't compromise. And Ehud Barak says, I've unmasked Arafat. We gave them everything they would want, and they still said no. They don't want peace. They're really not interested in peace. So on the Palestinian side, Arafat's requests for clarification of issues were reported falsely as a rejection of the offer. Clinton said, or I should say Dennis Ross, who was Clinton's chief negotiator in this, said that Ehud Barak's condemnation of Arafat was entirely 100% correct. But then Ross turns around to other audiences and says, I hold both sides accountable. Ehud Barak, for his part, says, look, once the Second Intifada emerged, he looked so much more reasonable than Arafat that he gained a strategic advantage with the United States. And that was the advantage that Netanyahu lost for the Israelis when he's before. Okay, so any thoughts about this before I move on here in terms of the way the Israelis are seeing this and the way the Palestinians are seeing it? I do. Let me take a minute and just clarify. Israel is oftentimes referred to this as, look, we basically gave you two states. We gave you your own independent state. We gave up, we were putting it on the table and you refused. So that's the interpretation, that Arafat really squandered that opportunity, walked away from it. For Arafat, the talks really were duplicitous, right? He didn't even want to go. I'm giving you his perspective now. He got a lot of pressure from President Clinton that we need you there, right? And recall, Clinton's got an ulterior motive here, which is he's trying to salvage a reputation as a world leader after being terribly damaged by his impeachment and the Monica Lewinsky affair. So I'm going to come to your question in a minute, Sylvia. But Arafat says that, look, when I get there, we didn't really have any basis to be talking these principles. All of the pre-talk efforts hadn't gotten very far. And now you get like the president of the United States, the prime minister of Israel, and the president of the Palestinian Authority in a room, and you're expecting us to get to a peace agreement when none of the groundwork has been done. It's being rushed. There's elections happening in Israel. There's elections happening in the United States. The Palestinians can't be pushed along a timeline that isn't our timeline. And then, look, we had already given up 78% of our homeland in 1948. Now you're saying, oh, it's only 10%, 90%. You're only giving up 10%. 10% on top of 78%, says Arafat. And more importantly, most importantly, Arafat said there's not really an offer on the table. It was never written down. There was never a cohesive package that we could look at and negotiate over. Okay, yeah. So go ahead, Sylvia, please.
So going back a minute, I think I got a little confused there. Why, when it got to the issue of Temple Mount, did Clinton not clarify his position or the Israeli position on that issue to Arafat?
Well, according to yeah, that's a great question. According to Dennis Ross, and they felt that Arafat was being cute. They interpreted Arafat's questioning of this as Arafat trying to weasel out of an agreement. That this was historic, this was an opportunity, and that if he had just signed on at that moment, it would have been great, and we could have had the agreement. And that Arafat, by asking questions, was his way of indicating that he was not serious. So they didn't take it seriously, his question.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's, there's a lot of personalities here. It's a very intense moment. Again, reminding you of the political context of that Clinton's in and that Ehud Barak is in. Both. They're in trouble politically for different reasons.
Right. And Bill is trying to salvage his reputation as an international negotiator. Gotcha.
As the guy who solved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, finally, right? I mean, we can say a lot of things about Jimmy Carter. A lot of people say, oh, President Carter, well, he wasn't so great, but he did get an agreement between Israel and Egypt, put that together, and look, it's still in place. Yes, Michael.
A good discussion today. But the one thing that you did not say that Dennis Ross said about Arafat, that he was the biggest liar you ever heard. He never said anything that he did not change his mind, all the different stories. He's a big liar. That's why they never took him seriously. That's why they finally give him a choice. Either you're with us or you're not. And that's what it came to.
Well, that's interesting. His preceding reputation. Yeah. And I think that's also an interesting thing as well. So, all right. So let's talk about what happens afterwards, because that's really critical here. I'm flipping ahead with my So when Ariel Sharon wins the election in 2000, he won decisively. 62% of the vote went for Likud, 38% went through Barak, and this starts a whole another era. After the Second Intifada begins, right? Here's how it begins, right? He goes to in the campaign. Israel goes to suppress those protests that the Palestinians have, that Sharon says, look, we have every right to be here. This is part of Israel. A number of Israeli police officers are injured in those, and a couple hundred of Palestinians are wounded. In the days that follow, scores of people die. Arab citizens of Israel, we talked about this last week, get really involved and they join the demonstrations. And that led to more and more violence between protesters and Israeli police. From October 1, 2000 to October 10, 2000, 13 Israeli Arabs lost their lives and hundreds were wounded. And that launched more than 5 years of Palestinian-Israeli deadly violence, oftentimes referred to as the Second Intifada. I have a little bit of some footage here, so I thought it would be worthwhile watching just to get a feeling for this.
It was a tragedy in human.
I don't recommend this video, but there's some good footage in it. Here, right around here.
On September 28th, 2000, a delegation from the Likud party accompanied opposition leader Ariel Sharon on a visit to the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism. The compound also includes 2 famous Islamic landmarks, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, because of the sensitive nature of the Temple Mount, the Israeli government has enforced a controversial ban arranged with Muslim leadership on non-Muslims praying there. When Sharon and the Likud delegation visited the site, hundreds of riot police accompanied them. The visit was only approved by the Israeli government after receiving assurances from the Palestinian Authority's security chief that Sharon could enter the compound without incident so long as he didn't go into the mosque. And Israeli intelligence independently came to the same conclusion. Sharon's time visiting the compound was pretty uneventful. He didn't enter a mosque and made no statement while on the Temple Mount. And although there was no immediate reaction from the Palestinians, rioting broke out just as he left. Young men coming out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque threw stones towards Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall. And in the ensuing scuffle, Israeli police fired tear gas and rubber bullets. 25 policemen were injured, 1 seriously, while 3 Palestinians were hurt by the rubber bullets. One day after Sharon's visit, large riots broke out in the old city of Jerusalem. Palestinians again threw rocks down at Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, and after the Jerusalem police chief was rendered unconscious by a rock attack, the police switched to using live ammunition. At the end of the day, 7 Palestinians lay dead. 200 civilians, including Israelis, Palestinians, tourists, were wounded, as were 70 Israeli police officers. Demonstrations soon took place throughout the Palestinian territories. Israeli security forces responded with both rubber bullets and live ammunition. Almost 50 Palestinians were killed and more than 1,800 were injured in the first 5 days. Palestinians blamed Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, which they saw as an intentional provocation for the outbreak of the violence. But the underlying cause, according to many Palestinians, was actually the continuing Israeli presence in the West Bank, even after the Oslo agreements. Despite the Palestinian leadership not keeping up their side of the agreements, Palestinians expected their lives to improve after Oslo, with greater freedoms and control. They not only failed to see these things materialize, but they viewed the situation as having worsened by the end of the decade. Many Palestinians believed that diplomacy had proven fruitless and turned instead to confrontation. What made this conflict different was the prevalence and level of brutality, which far exceeded anything seen during the First Intifada. In the immediate aftermath of Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, the violence began to escalate. On September 30th, 2000, there was a gunfight between Palestinians and Israeli troops in a Gaza Strip alleyway. Video taken by a Palestinian cameraman working for French TV showed a father and his 12-year-old son huddled together next to a concrete cylinder, the father trying to protect his son from the bullets. The voiceover by the French television station said that the boy, Mohammed al-Dura, had been killed by Israeli fire. Mohammed was viewed as a martyr throughout the Muslim world. Postage stamps from Arab countries showed the heart-wrenching image of father and son trying to stay alive. As time went on, however, both the accuracy of the reporting on this incident and the events themselves began to be questioned. It was revealed that several seconds of footage were cut from the TV broadcast showing the boy apparently still alive. Also, the Palestinians didn't conduct an investigation into the boy's death, and no autopsy was performed. Another tragic event occurred 12 days later. 2 Israeli Defense Force reservists accidentally entered the city of Ramallah. Palestinian police stopped them and took them to a police station. Now, the atmosphere in the city was tense at that time, as thousands had just attended the funeral of a 17-year-old killed in clashes with Israeli troops. An angry mob numbering more than 1,000 assembled in front of the police station, demanding the death of the Israelis. It wasn't long before they stormed the building and murdered the 2 soldiers. It appears the Palestinian policemen inside attempted to prevent the lynching, as most of them suffered injuries during the incident.
So you get an idea of how this just gets spiraling out of control. Now, Sharon looks at all, right? Sharon ran his election campaign against the Camp David talks, against the idea of giving territory away. And he became both the leader of Likud, but also the leader of Gush Emunim, a greater Israel. Netanyahu is completely out of the picture here. He's not a member of the Knesset, Netanyahu, and therefore he's ineligible to run. So let me talk about this intifada, right? As you mentioned in the video, right? This is much more violent than the first one. And we see a lot of suicide bombings. This is when suicide bombing it's the first time that suicide bombing is used as a strategy in a national conflict. There have been suicide bombings. We've talked about this and that, but now Hamas, who's really a big part of this and has rejected all of the Oslo framework, rejected negotiations, looking at the supposed victory of Hezbollah and pushing the Israelis out of southern Lebanon, says, look, if we do violence, we'll push Israel out of Palestine. But these, because of the animosity and frustration that common everyday Palestinians are experiencing with the sort of, stalemate of the Oslo process, areas B have never transferred to A, areas C have never transferred to B. And all of the checkpoints and all of the different difficulties and the clampdown in response to this violence by the Israeli Defense Forces only drives more support towards the violence of the Intifada, including the suicide bombing. Now, the violence reaches a peak in mid-2002, in which there are 7,000 casualties, over 1,000 dead Palestinians, almost 3,300 wounded Palestinians, 450 dead Israelis, 2,300 wounded Israelis. By the end of 2005, there are more than 38,000 casualties as a result of this. 1,000 Israelis die. And about 50% of the Israeli deaths are from suicide bombs. So it's a particularly gruesome and terrifying. Palestinians carried out almost 150 such suicide attacks. And what's really frustrating to Israelis, or terrifying, or both, is that the majority of Palestinians in this period are really supporting the idea of these suicide bombings. They're celebrating these people, right? Now, there's another part of this, which is that the uprising wasn't only directed at Israel, it was also directed at the Palestinian Authority, and particularly at Arafat. When Arafat dies in 2000, right? So why is that? Well, there's a lot of corruption, a lot of that money, which we talked about last week, that's coming in from international sources, is being lost, right? Corrupted, and Arafat is seen as behind that. The younger militants that emerge and become more and more militant, people are getting frustrated that their lives are not improving as concessions are supposedly being made. And Arafat, this peaceful diplomacy idea is deeply contrasted in the popular imagination among Palestinians with what's happened to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. They won. Hezbollah does this really good propaganda campaign that it was them who kicked out the Israelis, as opposed to Ehud Barak saying we don't want to be involved in this anymore. And so the Palestinian Authority is really taking a hit. And then when Arafat can't get a handle on this, and there's more and more people getting killed by Palestinian suicide bombings and also by Israeli responses, he says, look, we have no control over our own security services because the Israelis attacking our own security services because Israel feels that the Palestinian security services are involved with the violence, which they were. But he says it's because of that, I can't get a clamp down on this violence. The nationalist young guard that emerged as an organized militia, these are the nationalists, not the Hamas, corresponding with the Hamas, emerged in the West Bank, the Al-Aqsa Brigades. You probably remember that term. These are people who are not Muslim fanatics, extremists. They're just Palestinian activists who have decided that this is the way to go. What's interesting about it is that when Arafat dies in 2004, there's an election and Mahmoud Abbas is elected to replace him. And the violence starts to dissipate. Support for suicide attacks among Palestinians starts to go down considerably in 2005. It should be noted, this intifada was very powerful because it was extensively reported on and broadcast by the international media, and most importantly by Al Jazeera, which is a Qatar-based television station, right? That's with very high production values, like CNN level. And because they're a Qatar crew, they can get into the West Bank and to Gaza and interview and film and show all this stuff on television. So while everybody in the world, millions upon millions of people in the region, in the world, are seeing these violent confrontation, and it's shaping how people are seeing things, including that bit I just showed you about this Palestinian father and his son, Mohammed Dura, who caught in this crossfire, and the lynching of these IDF soldiers. So Sharon, in power, says the way we're going to deal with this is we're going to crush the Palestinians. And that happens in the context of the new president replacing George W. Bush, replacing Clinton, and the total discrediting of Arafat when Israel intercepts this ship, the Korean A ship that's carrying 50 tons of weapons for the Palestinians that Israelis say came from Iran for the Palestinians to use. So there's a new boss in town, right? Remember, this is a unipolar world. Who's in charge of the United States really matters in terms of their approach. And the fact that Arafat is getting supplies from Iran, who George W. Bush said after the 9/11 attacks, says Iran is part of the axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea, doesn't really endear Arafat too much to George W. Bush. So, I mean, really what's happened here is Arafat has completely misread the political environment. He's underestimated Israeli support for Sharon. He thought the violence in the Second Intifada would give him a conversation with George W. Bush, and Bush decides instead that he'll negotiate with anybody but Arafat. Get rid of Arafat if you want American support for the Palestinian cause or for any kind of negotiations. Sharon responds and says, look, what we need to do is we're going to, and I'm going to get to the roadmap in a minute, we need more security, right? There's suicide bombings. Civilians are getting blown up at pizza places and in buses, and hundreds and hundreds of Israelis are getting murdered in the most horrific way. So he divides the West Bank up into 64 different sections. He divides the Gaza into 4 sections, and then he uses trenches and concrete barriers, 450 different checkpoints, barriers, and roadblocks by the end of 2002. Let me see if I have that map. I have that map someplace. Yeah. So you can kind of get the point. All of these areas have all these roadblocks. And then he, and by the way, Israel as a whole feels like these crackdowns are justified and these methods are necessary. And in 2002, Sharon begins the construction of a barrier to run the length of the West Bank all around it, right? Following the 1967 borders, going into West Bank where it would incorporate some of the Israeli settlements and take some Palestinian lands for construction route. That barrier ends up separating more than 50,000 Palestinians, 142,000 acres of West Bank land, and says inside of there you have very restricted access. In some towns, there are 20-foot high walls that enclose, and so you can see things like this, right? There are other places where it's a simple fence, but don't, right? And so there's arguments that go back and forth. It's not a security wall, it's a security fence. And then you get, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
It's important to explain why the wall is so high, what the purpose of it is. Can you explain that? Can you explain that?
Well, let me just say that it's very successful. It reduces terror attacks by 60%, a 30% reduction in casualties, and Hamas comes to the table and negotiates a truce.
The most important part was they were shooting from their villages across to the Jewish settlers. They were killing them by shooting them from afar. That is why you have a concrete wall, not just a simple fence with some barbed wire. That is the reason. They were shooting across the border into Israel and killing civilians, even though they were settlers. That is the reason for that. The other thing, as long as I'm speaking, that's the point I wanted to make, because otherwise people don't get why is there such a wall. As a matter of fact, when I met with the Palestinians a couple of weeks ago, he was against the wall. And I told him, we are against the wall too. Don't shoot the Israelis, they will take down the wall. I just wanted to say one thing about very, very important acute observation that is not, probably you would not find it in the papers or in the reading that you did. When George W. Bush came to power, the fear was that he was going to be just like his father and be siding against Israel. Mm-hmm. And Sharon made a public comment. He said, "We are not going to be another Czechoslovakia that you will sell us to the Arabs." Would you believe that? Only later we find out that George W. Bush became such a strong supporter of Israel that on YouTube you can see him coming to Israel toward the end of his term, and is getting such a huge reception because it was exactly the opposite of what Sharon originally was afraid it would be.
Well, he was certainly friendly with Sharon, and they got along quite well.
But not in the beginning. That's the point I'm making. When Sharon made a statement to the world, and he says, we are not going to be sold, okay, like Czechoslovakia, okay? And that was the fear that that Bush was going to be the same as his father, and he was not. He was a very religious person. And
I have so much more to cover, Michael. I'm sorry to cut you
I just want to make that point.
Thank you. No, it's an interesting part of this history. And I just wanted to show you, this is a picture I took when I was in Bethlehem. This is a painting by the famous artist Banksy on one of the barriers between the West Bank and Israel proper. And you could see this kind of art in a few places throughout Israel. So this, I just thought it was interesting again. So this wall was, as you point out, right, kind of successful, but and it results in a truce with Islamic Jihad and well, actually with Hamas, and that Islamic Jihad kind of backs off some of these suicide bombings starting in January in 2005. Palestinian living standards during this period of time plummet. By the middle of 2003, 40% of children living in the West Bank and Gaza are malnourished. Their number one trading partner, Israel, is closed themselves off in response to the terror. 60% of West Bank residents and 80% of Gaza residents are living in 2003 below the international poverty line, which is incredibly, incredibly low. After 2005, when Israel leaves the Gaza Strip, and I'll talk about that in a minute, things get worse on the Gaza Strip, not better. I'll talk about that in a minute. Should be noted that Sharon obviously is known as a right-wing super hawk in Israel and elsewhere, right? He was the guy who went all the way up to Beirut in '82 in the war at Lebanon, and right? So his decision in 2005 to get out of Gaza, to evacuate all the settlers using Israeli military to get them out of Gaza, and also from 4 different small settlements in the northern West Bank. This was very surprising to most. 8,500, I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to, where is it? Oh, wrong way. That's why I have my pictures a little messed up. This is a unilateral disengagement, right? Israel doesn't ask the Palestinians, it just gets out. And 8,500 settlers are evacuated from Gaza. 21 different settlements are dismantled there. In the West Bank, 680 more settlers are evacuated from 4 dismantled settlements there. And that cost a lot of money. That cost over $2 billion. Israel retained control over the Gaza Strip's coastline and the airspace along with Egypt. But Sharon was the very first Israeli leader to dismantle a settlement in areas regarded by Israelis as part of the land of Israel. He continues this move in November 21st in 2005, he leaves Likud. And by the way, he had won 2 electoral victories as the head of Likud. And he creates a centrist party. Kadima means forward. And that party continues to call for more unilateral disengagements from the West Bank. And that's where they're headed. And then Sharon has a stroke in 2006. Meanwhile, Arafat, starting around late 2003 to 2004, his health is really getting bad. And it included, like at one point he has an health emergency, and he has to go to France, and then he dies on November 11th, 2004. And he's replaced by Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas wins an election, and I went over that last week. There's a lot, right? 62% of the vote goes to Abbas. Turnout is very high, about 65% turnout. It's very high when you consider that Hamas boycotts the elections. And Abbas, it's really interesting, and then I'm going to come to your point, Michael. Abbas calls for a more open Palestinian system. And he has a whole bunch of election rounds, local election rounds throughout the West Bank in 2005. And he says we should demilitarize the Intifada. Doesn't say we should end it, we should demilitarize it. Now, in those elections, interestingly enough, Hamas does very, very well. It wins most of the seats in the big city elections. And Abbas, rather than rejecting that, begins a serious dialogue between Fatah, his party, and Hamas, who has been at loggerheads. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, I just want to make a comment on this unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. The atmosphere was, the thinking was, we just get out of there. The same reasoning as in Lebanon. We don't need them to mess with them. Let them be the way they want. The Palestinian says, if you just leave us alone, everything will be fine, okay? And Sharon said, let me try that. And the withdrawal, the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza had the name. What's the name? Scott, what is the name of the withdrawal operation?
Ani lo yodea. I can't remember.
Gaza first. Gaza first. You show us that Gaza, you can handle Gaza. We will also withdraw from the West Bank. And that, you know, the rest of history, what happened in Gaza. It became worse than Lebanon.
No. And what's very upsetting to a lot of people who left on the peace side of things and the labor side of things was that there was a lot of infrastructure that it was built in the Israeli settlements, greenhouses and factories and things like that. And Hamas went in and destroyed it all right away.
Let me add to this, please.
All of it.
Okay. American Jews bought from the Israeli Jews all these plantations and all this equipment and gave it to them, to the Palestinians, and they totally stole the whole thing and destroyed it. On top of that, there were 5,000 families in brand new houses in Gaza. What happened to that? Do you know, Scott, and why? 5,000 brand new housing, okay, were destroyed by the Israelis because Arafat told them to destroy them because there was fear that the Palestinians in Gaza will have a civil war over the 5,000 houses. And so the Israelis were forced to destroy the houses they were willing to give them to the Palestinians.
Okay, now, through all of this, throughout the Intifada, through all of these very tumultuous things that we're describing, there were still efforts to conclude an agreement, believe it or not, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There was a unofficial Geneva Accords in 2003. There was this Gaza disengagement. There was all of these things were efforts to try to jumpstart the peace negotiations once again. In 2000, there was a fact-finding committee set up by President Clinton in November of 2000, and it was chaired by the former Senator George Mitchell. It was centered at Sharm el-Sheikh, and it was a fact-finding committee that was trying to figure out why did the peace process fail and how to get back to it. And one of the things they said was Israel should stop using live ammunition in responding to the Intifada. The Palestinians didn't use real firearms in most cases of the early part of the Intifada, and that the Palestinians needed to stop using terrorism and arrest, and they needed to start arresting terrorists, their security forces, and Israel needed to freeze all of their settlements. All of those things would be necessary to get back to the negotiating table. All of that was given to George W. Bush in 2001, and he tabled it. But Bush recognized that a two-state solution should include a Palestinian state. And when he said that, that was an historic statement from the President of the United States. He said it in June of 2002. I'm going to move ahead. And I'm not going to watch this video because I have a few things I still want to go over with you guys that are important. And then he had this roadmap for peace that was he was set up along with I'm going to come that he set up with the so-called quartet. That is the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and Russia. That's the quartet, those four groups. And with the winding down of the war in Iraq, and Arafat's recognition of Abbas as the prime minister, they had this idea that they would have a phased roadmap to peace, which was then resurrected in 2007, once again, at the end of Bush's presidency. And let me just, where is my, I have it back here. Okay. So here are the three phases. And I think these are significant. The first phase is a stabilization phase, right? This is in the middle of at the peak of the Intifada. We got to stop violence from Palestinians. We've got to have comprehensive political reform in the PA. They've got to have more elections. They've got to have a constitution. Secondly, on the other side, Israel has to stop building those settlements. They have to get out of areas that they since occupied since 2000. And they've got to try to do what they can to normalize life for Palestinians, meaning let's relax some of these checkpoints. Obviously, this stabilization phase was going to be critical before they could go anywhere. So there was a recognition that peace doesn't just happen all at once. And it was kind of a retort in an implicit way to Ehud Barak's take it or leave it, or Clinton's take it or leave it approach. Here, we're going to develop stable, we're going to stop the violence. Second phase is something that hasn't happened, right? We've been talking about this from the first day of class. The Palestinians need to have institutions that are reliable, that are not corrupted. There's got to be a Palestinian state with provisional borders, and you've got to show that you can do that. You've got to have security. You've got to have normalization of life for the Palestinians, and you've got to have political reform. That's the state building period. In other words, if you want your own country, you've got to indicate that you have the capacity to govern it. And then the third phase is that permanent resolution. Consolidation of all those reforms, stabilization of Palestinian institutions, permanent status agreement would be negotiated as a response, right? So that's the roadmap to peace. And remember who's behind it. It's not just George W. Bush and Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat. It is the EU, the European Union. It is the United Nations, and it is the United States, and it is Russia. So, and this is really important. Now, as I said, there were elections. So we're starting down this road. And guess who wins the elections in Palestine? Hamas, right? And since that time, there have been 5 different. So Hamas ends up winning the elections, ends up getting full control over Gaza. I'm not going to get into all the details because we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to highlight a couple of big things before I talk about President Trump and Obama and Trump. But because there are 5 different violent outbreaks between 2006 and 2021. I'm going to probably get out of here now. I didn't finish my slides, as you can see. And these include, I don't want to say they're wars, but they are fought with military. With Hezbollah in 2006, in the summer of 2006, there's a re-engagement there. And then there are 4 separate conflicts that are very violent with Hamas in Gaza. In 2008, December 2008 to January 2009, in November of 2012, a particularly horrible one in July of 2014, and then very recently in May of 2021. Now, during this period, right, there's still efforts. In 2007, under President Bush, with Condoleezza Rice, they try to resurrect this roadmap to peace. And then in the second term of Obama, right, Obama's second term, Secretary of State John Kerry engages in his own kind of shuttle diplomacy back and forth between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And then Trump comes in and he says, and by the way, none of that goes anywhere. And it's very frustrating to all of the actors that these efforts to try to keep at it for the two-state solution are not working. And then Trump says, look, I got a different approach. I'm going to give you the deal of the century, right? The effort here is to really build on the two-state solution, but add in this other piece of financial incentive for the Palestinian Authority to the tune of billions of dollars of US aid, which goes nowhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I will I will say there's some optimism. There's reason to have some optimism, right? There's the regional Abraham Accords that were signed in 2020, which resulted in normalization agreements between Israel and 4 Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Now, you might say, well, how did that happen? Trump's foreign policy, you probably remember, it was America first, right? So, and it was very much about, well, if it's not in our interest, why are we doing it? So we get out of the Paris Climate Accords, we get out of the JCPOA, because that's according to Trump, that's a bad deal for the United States, Iran nuclear agreement. We withdraw. He's got this idea that we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. He starts negotiating with the Taliban to get the United States out of Afghanistan, which Biden completes. And he gets out of the World Health Organization. So this is the idea, right? But with the Middle East, it's a much more complex, ironically, approach. On one hand, he reduces US involvement in Syria and in Iraq. And on the other hand, he's got this approach to regionalizing the conflict. And in other words, to getting a peace deal by creating a regional move that has an outreach to Saudi Arabia at the heart of it from the United States. So his deal of the century, which is of course negotiated primarily by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is heavily geared to Israeli concerns. And when it fails, when the Palestinians reject it out of hand, by the way, Trump goes to Israel a number of times, goes to, has Netanyahu the White House, go and meets with Mahmoud Abbas several times alone to talk to him about this deal of the century. And at one point in New York, Abbas says, oh, I'm kind of optimistic about this. I think that maybe we're onto something here. So there's this belief that maybe something might come out of this. But in the end, it's 70 to 80% of the West Bank, not 90%. And it's there's lots of it that Jerusalem is going to be controlled by Israel, although the Palestinians will have a capital in East Jerusalem. It'll still be fully controlled by Israel. There's just, the Palestinians reject it out of hand. The Israelis are willing to talk about it. Netanyahu, who gets along quite well with Trump, is willing to talk about this. But the Palestinians say, no, go, so it's not going to happen. But when it fails, interestingly enough, that may have been the ironic reason why the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and in the background, Saudi Arabia, were willing to say, hey, you know what? This Israeli-Palestinian conflict was yesterday's news. We're going to deal with Israel and negotiate. We've got another foe to worry about, which is Iran. And if Saudi Arabia is trying to organize with Israel and with, the most powerful military in the area to normalize these relations economically and, more importantly, militarily, this is a good deal for us. So the Abraham Accords are successful as it becomes apparent that this is not going anywhere. So I'm going to ask this general question. Where does this leave the two-state solution? On the one hand, you could say the settlements make it very difficult. More than 400, by middle of 2021, more than 450,000 Israelis in 132 different settlements are in the West Bank. There are 220,000 Israelis in East Jerusalem. There are another 124 outposts, quote unquote, outposts in the West Bank. This is before Netanyahu's resumption of power. And they're now greenlighting, I think 33,400, I could be wrong about that, on potential new settlements in the West Bank. Another way to think about it is since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, the settler population in the West Bank, not counting East Jerusalem, has more than doubled. No, I'm sorry, more than quadrupled. And if you talk about that, right, if you think about that, and that's where that's where the Palestinian state's going to be centered on the West Bank, Gaza smaller, that makes it really challenging. Moreover, support for the two-state solution among Palestinians has plummeted. The late 1990s, about 70% of Palestinians supported a two-state solution. A vast majority of Palestinians liked it. It's below 40% now, according to Shikaki's public opinion polls of the Palestinians. Among Israeli Jews, support for the two-state solution has also dropped. And many Israelis feel like even if it's desirable, you can't do it without entailing some major security risks that are going to be we can't do that. So the question is, if all of those obstacles are standing in the way of a two-state solution, and we've been talking about this the whole time, from the partition from 1948, from 1937 with the UN Peel Commission, right? 1947 and on. If we're now saying, okay, we're not going to be able to have a two-state, well, then what's the one-state solution, right? Lots of Palestinians, especially in the diaspora, intellectuals, have been writing about equal citizenship for anybody who lives in that area called Israel right now, including the West Bank and Gaza. There would be no national borders, that it would just be one big country, and that everybody would have equal rights. It's interesting that a lot of Israelis are talking about a confederation, much like the United States has a federal system where we have a national government, and then we have states that are part of the same country, that this could be a system that would work, but that people like in the United States could freely go into one state to the other state, and they'd still be citizens of the national government. But at the same time, you've got a couple of pieces that kind of go in the other direction. You've got the recent passage of the Basic Law, which says that Israel is and will be a Jewish state, right? That we have this national identity that is, it's going to be a Jewish state. So will the Palestinians want to repeal that if there's going to be a one-state solution? Is it going to be a non-sectarian, not a Jewish state anymore? How's that going to go over for the millions of Jews who like that idea, not just in Israel, but all over the world? It seems that we're at an impasse. And I want you to think about a couple of things as you conceive of this. Let me just come out and say, I'm a supporter of a two-state solution. And I don't think a one-state solution is at all even remotely possible. As a Jew, as a Zionist, I can't imagine that we would ever say, oh, we're not going to be a Jewish state anymore. That we wouldn't have a country like that. We would just say it's a secular country. where Jews can live. And Jews can live in the United States too, and Jews can live in Canada, and Jews can live in Germany, for God's sake, right? But I want to say that the possibility of the two-state solution, as remote as it seems right now, should not be considered out of hand, something that will be rejected. Leadership can change at any minute. We've seen it happen before. We've seen it happen in very important moments. Look at what happened with Sadat after Nasser. Look what happened with Rabin. Look what happened with Sharon and his move in 2005 and where he was headed. New leadership can emerge in the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas is not going to last much longer. There's going to be new leaders. We don't know what they're going to want to do, what importance they might place on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Hamas could be toppled. New leadership in the Palestinian Authority could be focused on joining Bahrain and Morocco and United Arab Emirates and trying to be part of that coalition, as they have said already that they want to be part of, and they're doing business, the PA, with all of those countries. The question of a two-state solution needs to be understood in terms of those broader contextual realities. We could have a different kind of a president in 3 years or 2 years. We could have the same president in 2 years. The United States support for the Israeli government as it is could decline, which would place pressure on whoever's in Israel who wants to compete with that government and to resurrect a U.S. relationship that is stronger economically and militarily to try to embrace a two-state solution. There's all sorts of ways where this can go. But ultimately, I think all of that is less important than the reality, which is that the Jews don't really have another place to go. This is the homeland. And for the Jews to say, and this is my personal opinion, okay, so and you absolutely should disagree with me if you do. For Israel to ever say that they won't be Israel, I don't think we'd ever say that. And so the only option is really occupation cannot go on forever, and so there's got to be a second state. And so I would love to hear from you guys. Let me stop right there.
Donna?
Oh, I don't have the nerve to raise my hand because I don't have any answers. But I've been reading a lot about it, and I've been listening to what's going on today in Israel with the protest movements and everything, and also the other side. So many of us are learning more and more about how the Arab Palestinians, who are citizens sort of Israel, really don't want to be in a Jewish state of Israel. They seem to want to have the Palestinian state. So I don't have an opinion on what should happen, except that I don't quite see why, if the Palestinians could just get together and decide what kind of a state they would like to have, would it be non-religious? Would it be just an Arab state? Would it be an Islamic state? Would it be a non-religious state? I guess the land is more important, but still, I think the conversation about what kind of peoplehood, we know our peoplehood is pretty conflicted too, because of the ultra-Orthodox versus the secular and the, I don't know, traditionalists. I'm babbling. I just know it's a very interesting topic, and we'll need to continue talking.
I think those are really important observations, that the extremists, that there's issues of religious difference and secular religiousness and secular. I think these are really important considerations, and not to mention the ongoing fight between Hamas and Fatah, which has not gone away, right? And then there's other complications in that relationship. It's very complicated. Sylvia, please.
I don't know the answer either, but I think that I can't imagine that we would not want a Jewish state. I mean, I totally agreed with you, is that this is we need it. I mean, there we are. But the other issue for me is how do you do that when here you are with all of these Jews in territories that the Palestinians want, or whatever, because we took them after 1967 and we still got them, even though we pulled back, then we went back again. And what Arab, I mean, what Palestinian state would agree to be a Palestinian state where Israel said, well, you can live in East Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is ours. You can have this tiny little town next door, and that's your capital. I mean, that is not reasonable to me. So it appears that it's going to take quite a miracle for us to get through this loggerhead. But I do agree that there should be a two-state system.
I think those are really important observations. The devil is in the details, as you have observed very closely here. Yeah. Well, I think that I will send you guys several articles that I've read and assigned before on exploring this concept of one state, two state solutions by some Israeli authors and Palestinians that I think are particularly helpful. And so, Marcia,
I was actually interested, Karen. First of all, nice to see your face. I know that this was a very important class for you to take, and I would love to sort of like in retrospect after 12 weeks, because I don't think you really missed. I mean, you were there. What? And what do you think? I'd love to know. I think if you can unmute, that would be awesome.
Okay, I've been very, very quiet for a reason, very emotive subject. I'm very conflicted about this subject, and I'm going to say two things. I'm going to say, I think there's one thing is very basic, and I know this in the context of all these protests as well. On a very basic level, there is so much anger on both sides that there is never, ever, ever, ever going to be any form of peace in the next, I don't see it happening in the next 20 years. And the second thing is, and this is absolute crime, and this happens this is a fault of international relations, because I'm a bit of a romantic. Sorry, Michael. I know I love hearing Michael every week. I love it. I love the debate. I never forget what Amos Oz once said. He said, and I know it's very left-wing, and I know this is totally out of fashion, and it's totally not the two-state solution. He said, get the all land is a material good. It's just it's property, private property. That we're obsessed with private property, and land is just property, and it's man-made, it's artificial. So what the Israelis, so what the long history, the myth. You read Hans Kohn, lovely Jewish guy on nationalism, all a myth, a bloody myth. All the land I'm sitting on now is all built on blood and myth making. And on that note, I feel that the best solution is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. A one-state solution only, with the Jews and Palestinians. I know this is completely ridiculous. No more settlements. And the Jews and Palestinians living together, normally having dual passports. If the Palestinians Palestinians can have their own national, it can be a national group within, like, I don't know, it's just like, I can't explain. Like London is in England, for example. London and England, we're so divided. There's the London and there's the rest of England, but we're still living in England. We're still part of England. Don't know how long for, though. It looks like Wales and Scotland, but I don't know. There's been a controversy in Scotland, so this is it. This is the secret to all of it, is no of course there's boundaries because you've got the sea and mountains and woods and all sort. That's just natural boundaries. But the sea, that's what I would love to see. It's not going to happen. Everyone hates each other. Now it's complete. I just heard on the Radio 4 because I'm in London, so I live in London, so I get a different perspective. That the West Bank is an anarchic state, and I'm hearing about both sides, people being killed on both sides every day, and it's terrible. I don't even Netanyahu, because he's going to go. He's got to go. He's got to go. He's got to get rid of him soon. Sorry, Michael. Sorry, I love you. I love you. I love hearing I love hearing what you have to say. I love it because it enriches the conversation. And what do I know? I'm just a Northwest London Jewish girl sitting in my little house in Hendon. What do I know? Nothing. But I'm saying one state solution, Jews and Palestinians together. That's it. Two governments.
You know what?
One parliament, two governments. Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's not going to happen.
A lot of people agree with you. You're not. That's a completely legitimate approach.
It is, Karen.
People, you know, Karen, I mean, a lot of leading.
Sorry about shouting so much.
No, leading Jewish intellectuals are saying that. Leading Palestinian intellectuals are saying that. So I don't think it's too far off base. And I understand why you say it. I totally get it. And it is horrible what's happening right this minute. It is terrifying. And yeah. So Michael, hey, guess what? You get the last word. I might get the last word. Go ahead.
Look, you're missing the whole point of the Jewish state. There was a reason why Israel was created, okay? Not to have another Middle Eastern country. The Jews want to have a place where they run the things the way they like to run it, in a Jewish way. And if it becomes a one-state solution, then it becomes just another Middle East state. That's all. It's going to be just like Egypt. It's going to be just like Jordan, like Lebanon. On top of that, why not? Why not, Karen? That's what it's the problem.
Because of identity, because of culture and identity.
The example that you gave about London and the rest of England does not hold because they are all British. These are two different people. As